A black family, polished and confident, steps into the first-class cabin of a prestigious airline. It's a moment that should be ordinary, a family embarking on a journey. But almost immediately, the atmosphere shifts. A flight attendant, clouded by bias, makes it clear they don't belong in her eyes. She dismisses them with curt remarks and avoids serving them properly, sparking murmurs among nearby passengers. But just 5 minutes later, the family does something no one expected. They reveal their true power, not with anger, but with dignity, poise, and an unshakable resolve. Their calm defiance begins to shift the energy of the cabin. Passengers start noticing, quietly filming the interactions, and soon, the situation spirals beyond the flight attendant's control. What unfolds next sends shockwaves across the airline industry, igniting a conversation about fairness, equality, and the deep-seated biases hiding in plain sight. Stay with me, because this story of courage and change will leave you inspired. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful tales that spark meaningful change. Let's begin. Karen Miller adjusted her navy blue blazer, the precise crease of her uniform as sharp as her demeanor. The early morning bustle of LAX hummed around her, a tapestry of conversations in different languages. The rumble of suitcase wheels, and the occasional announcement crackling over the PA system. After 22 years with Pacific Air, Karen prided herself on being a paragon of professionalism, a steward of order in an increasingly chaotic world. Yet, as she stood at the gate preparing for the flight to New York, she couldn't shake a peculiar unease creeping up her spine. Her fingers tapped against her tablet as she scrolled through the manifest. The name, Thomas, lingered briefly in her mind, though she couldn't say why. It was just another name, another family, but something about it made her pause. Setting the thought aside, she straightened her posture and fixed her gaze on the line forming at the gate. The morning's unconscious bias training flitted through her memory, a session she had dismissed as an unnecessary lecture on problems she didn't believe she contributed to. Karen had always believed in treating everyone the same. Fairness, she thought, was about consistency. Or was it? Her musings were interrupted by the arrival of the Thomases, a family of 4 moving with quiet confidence through the terminal. Michael Thomas, tall and composed, led the group. His wife Michelle carried herself with the kind of poise that suggested she was used to navigating difficult situations. Their teenage son James had his phone out, live streaming their travel experience to an unseen audience. Behind him, their youngest, 8-year-old Ava, clung to her mother's hand, her wide eyes taking in the airport's hustle and bustle. Karen noticed them instantly. Their presence was undeniable, an air of success and purpose radiated from the family. But something within her stiffened, a reflex she didn't fully understand or question. As they approached the gate, Karen's gaze narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Good morning," Michael said as he handed over their boarding passes. His voice was calm but carried a subtle edge of expectation, as though he had braced himself for something unseen. Karen scanned the tickets, her eyes flickering to the first class designation. The corners of her mouth tightened imperceptibly. "I'll need to verify these," she said, her tone measured, almost rehearsed. "Would you mind stepping aside for a moment?" Michael raised an eyebrow, a flicker of frustration passing over his face before he masked it. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "No problem," Karen replied quickly, though her clipped tone betrayed a tension simmering beneath the surface. "Just routine." Behind her, a colleague shifted uneasily, sensing the mounting tension. Passengers in the waiting area began to glance over, their curiosity piqued by the interaction. James, ever perceptive, adjusted his phone slightly, ensuring the exchange was captured. "Routine doesn't usually involve singling out first-class passengers," Michelle said evenly, her gaze steady on Karen. "Our tickets were cleared at security." Karen's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. "I understand, ma'am, but I have to follow protocol." "Protocol," Michelle echoed softly, her tone carrying a weight that made Karen bristle. It wasn't just the word, it was the unspoken challenge within it. The silence between them thickened, the air charged with unspoken truths. Around them, murmurs began to ripple through the waiting area. A passenger muttered, "Here we go again," loud enough for Karen to hear but too low to pinpoint who had spoken. Another adjusted their phone to discreetly capture the scene. The tension was no longer confined to the gate, it was spreading. A slow but undeniable escalation. James leaned toward his mother, whispering, "We're live. Over 500 viewers already." Michelle gave a subtle nod, her expression calm but resolute. She turned back to Karen. "We'd like to board now. Unless there's a legal reason preventing us from doing so." Karen hesitated, her grip tightening on the scanner. Her mind raced, grappling with the realization that she had no tangible reason to delay them. Yet something deeper, more insidious, held her back, a hesitation born not of logic but of instinct. The kind of instinct shaped by years of societal conditioning she had never thought to question. "Please step aside," Karen said finally, her voice colder than she intended. It was a command, not a request. Michael exhaled sharply, his calm demeanor slipping for just a moment. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "We've complied with every step of your so-called protocol. Now we're being delayed at the gate for no reason?" Karen opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She felt the weight of the eyes on her passengers, her colleagues, and now even her own conscience. Before she could speak, a young woman seated nearby stood up. "Excuse me," she said loudly enough to command attention. "I couldn't help but notice that no one else is being pulled aside like this. Why are they being treated differently?" The room went still. Karen's chest tightened as the question hung in the air, heavy with implication. She glanced at the woman, then back at the Thomases, who stood tall despite the growing tension. For the first time, Karen felt a crack in her composure, a fleeting but undeniable sense of doubt. Michael turned to the young woman, nodding his thanks before addressing Karen again. "We're not asking for special treatment," he said, his voice resonating with quiet strength. "We're asking to be treated with the same respect as everyone else." Karen hesitated, the scanner still clutched in her hand. In that moment, the facade of control she had built so carefully over decades of service began to falter. This wasn't just about protocol anymore, it was about something much deeper. Something she couldn't ignore. Behind her, a colleague whispered, "Karen, just let them board." The words jolted her, and she exhaled shakily. "You may board," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The Thomases moved past her, their heads held high, but the moment lingered, a palpable reminder of the silent battle that had just unfolded, a battle that was far from over. As Karen watched them walk down the jet bridge, she felt an unfamiliar unease settle in her chest. This wasn't the end of the story, it was only the beginning. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane taxied toward the runway. The hum of the engines was steady, reassuring, masking the tension that lingered like a specter in the air. The Thomas family settled into their seats in the first-class cabin, their movements deliberate, composed. Michelle glanced at Michael, her gaze meeting his for a fleeting moment. A silent exchange of strength. James adjusted his phone, ensuring it was within reach, while Ava clutched her stuffed bear tightly to her chest. Karen Miller moved purposefully through the aisle, her face a mask of professionalism. Yet, the calm she projected was a fragile veneer. Her hands trembled slightly as she collected the last of the boarding passes, her mind replaying the exchange at the gate. She couldn't shake the image of Michael's steady gaze or the young woman's pointed question. Why are they being treated differently? The words clung to her like a thorn. As the plane ascended, the cabin settled into a quiet rhythm. Karen began the first round of service, her movements mechanical, her smile practiced, but when she approached the Thomases' row, her steps faltered. Michael was reading, his expression unreadable. Michelle was typing something on her phone, her fingers moving with a deliberate precision. James was leaning toward the window, whispering into his phone's camera, the faint glow of the screen illuminating his focused expression. Karen hesitated. She had served thousands of passengers over the years. Yet in this moment, her usual confidence deserted her. She cleared her throat. "Would you like anything to drink?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Michael looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Water, please," he said, his tone polite but distant. Michelle didn't look up. "Same for me." Karen nodded quickly and moved on, her pulse quickening. It was a simple interaction, yet it felt like a test she wasn't sure she had passed. The tension, though unspoken, was palpable. It simmered beneath the surface, feeding on the weight of history. The accumulated slights and injustices that had etched themselves into the Thomases' lives. It was there in the way Michael's shoulders remained tense. Even as he read, it was there in the way Michelle kept glancing at her phone, her lips pressing into a thin line. And it was there in James's quiet narration, his voice steady but laced with resolve. "This is James Thomas," he said softly into his phone. "We're 30,000 feet above the ground. But the same old story is playing out. What you saw at the gate, what you've seen me share before, it's not new. It's just another day in the life of traveling while black." In the row behind them, an older white couple exchanged glances. The woman leaned toward her husband, whispering, "Why do they always have to make it about race?" James heard her. He didn't turn, didn't react. Instead, he tilted his phone slightly, ensuring her words were captured. "That," he said into the camera, "is the question they always ask. Isn't it? Why do we have to make it about race? Maybe because we don't get the luxury of ignoring it." Karen returned with the drinks, her movements brisk. She placed the glasses on their tray tables, avoiding their eyes. As she straightened, her gaze caught the flicker of James's phone screen. The words 4,000 viewers glowed in the corner. Her chest tightened. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, forcing a smile. "No, thank you," Michelle replied, her tone clipped. Karen moved away, but the unease followed her. As she passed through the cabin, she noticed the way passengers glanced at the Thomases, their curiosity thinly veiled. Some whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward James and his phone. Others shifted uncomfortably, their expressions a mixture of confusion and annoyance. Near the galley, Karen overheard two flight attendants murmuring. "Did you see that family in first class?" one said, live streaming the whole flight. The other shrugged. "Well, they paid for their tickets, didn't they? What's the big deal?" Karen's jaw tightened. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she had been following protocol, that she wasn't biased, but the words felt hollow, even to her. Midway through the flight, the tension escalated. A passenger in the economy section rang his call button, his voice cutting through the cabin like a blade. "Excuse me," he said loudly. "Can someone do something about that kid up there filming everything? It's disruptive." Karen hurried toward him, her steps quick. "Sir, is there a problem?" she asked, her tone calm but strained. The man, middle-aged with a thick mustache, gestured toward the first-class cabin. "Yes, there's a problem. That family is broadcasting this flight like it's some kind of reality show. It's making people uncomfortable." Karen glanced toward the Thomases. James was still live streaming, his voice low but clear. Michelle had turned in her seat, her expression sharp as she watched the exchange unfold. "I'll handle it," Karen said quickly, turning toward the Thomases. Her heart pounded as she approached their row. "I'm sorry," she began, addressing Michelle, "but we've had a complaint about your son's phone. I'll have to ask him to stop filming." Michelle straightened, her gaze steady. "Is filming against airline policy?" she asked. Karen hesitated. "Well, no, but then why are you asking him to stop?" Michelle interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "He's not disrupting anyone. He's simply documenting our experience. Some passengers feel uncomfortable," Karen replied, her voice faltering. Michelle's eyes narrowed. "Uncomfortable with what? The truth?" The words hit like a slap, reverberating through the cabin. Passengers nearby leaned in, their curiosity piqued. The man who had complained muttered something under his breath, his face reddening. Karen felt the weight of their gazes, the silent judgment pressing down on her. "I'm just trying to keep the peace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael spoke then, his voice low but commanding. "Sometimes keeping the peace means standing up for what's right." Karen met his gaze, and for a moment, she felt exposed, her carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of his words. She nodded stiffly and stepped back, retreating to the galley. In the quiet of the galley, Karen gripped the counter, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The words of her daughter Emily echoed in her mind. Fairness isn't about treating everyone the same. It's about recognizing when the system is stacked against someone. For the first time, she began to wonder if Emily had been right all along. Meanwhile, in the cabin, James ended his live stream, the screen flashing with notifications. Michelle leaned over, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing good," she said softly. James nodded, but his expression was troubled. "I just want them to see," he murmured. "They will." Michael said firmly. But sometimes, seeing isn't enough. Sometimes, you have to make them feel it. And as the plane soared through the darkened sky, it carried with it a story of tension and truth, of quiet resistance and unspoken battles. A story that had only just begun. The steady hum of the engines reverberated through the cabin, a sound meant to comfort, to reassure. But for the passengers of Flight 216, particularly the Thomases, it felt more like a low, droning reminder of the tension that hung in the air. The soft clinks of drink service in the aisles provided an illusion of normalcy. But beneath it, there was a charged silence, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Karen Miller stood in the galley, gripping the edge of the counter. Her hands trembled, and a sense of unease rippled through her chest. She had served countless flights over 2 decades. But this one was different. The weight of the earlier confrontation lingered, heavy as storm clouds on the horizon. She thought of the man's complaint, the sharp defiance in Michelle Thomas's voice, and the steady, unflinching gaze of Michael Thomas. For the first time, Karen felt like she was standing on a fault line, one she hadn't noticed before but that had been there all along. In the first-class cabin, James Thomas scrolled through the flood of comments on his live stream. His followers had ballooned to over 10,000 by the time he ended the broadcast. Support poured in expressions of solidarity, shared stories of discrimination, and promises to spread the word. But interspersed among them were the usual barbs. The vitriol he had come to expect. Always playing the victim. Maybe just follow the rules. And this wouldn't happen. Why make everything about race? He sighed, locking his phone. Same story, different day, he muttered. Michelle, seated beside him, placed a hand on his knee. The truth isn't always comfortable, James, she said, but that doesn't mean it's not worth telling. Michael, across the aisle, was watching the other passengers carefully. The older couple who had whispered earlier were now openly glaring at the family, their faces tight with disapproval. Further down the cabin, the man who had complained was speaking animatedly to the passenger beside him, gesturing toward the Thomases with barely concealed irritation. Karen re-entered the cabin, pushing the cart of meals with a forced smile. She moved deliberately, her professional mask firmly in place. But as she approached the Thomases, the air around her seemed to shift, charged with an unspoken tension. When she reached their row, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the tray. Chicken or pasta? She asked, her voice strained. Chicken, Michelle said without looking up. Same, Michael added. Karen placed the trays down carefully, her movements robotic. As she turned to leave, James spoke up, his voice cutting through the silence. Excuse me. Karen froze, her stomach twisting. She turned back, her smile brittle. Yes? Do you feel uncomfortable serving us? He asked, his tone measured but pointed. Michelle's head snapped up, her eyes widening slightly. Michael looked at James, his expression unreadable, but he didn't intervene. Karen blinked, stunned by the question. Of course not, she said quickly. Why would you ask that? James tilted his head, studying her. Because your hands are shaking, he said softly. Karen glanced down and saw, to her horror, that he was right. Her fingers trembled faintly against the edge of the cart. She quickly clasped her hands together, her face burning. I'm just tired, she said, the excuse sounding hollow even to her. James didn't reply. He simply nodded, a faint, knowing smile on his lips, and turned back to his meal. Karen retreated, the weight of his words following her down the aisle. The murmurs started shortly after dinner service. A flight attendant approached Karen in the galley, her face pale. There's a situation in economy, she said, her voice low. Karen frowned. What kind of situation? The attendant hesitated. A passenger is refusing to sit near another passenger, she said. He says he doesn't feel safe. Karen's stomach dropped. Who's he refusing to sit near? The attendant shifted uncomfortably. A young black man, she said. He's just sitting there, minding his own business. But the other guy is making a scene. Karen's chest tightened. She followed the attendant down the aisle, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. When she reached the row in question, she saw the young man sitting by the window, his headphones on, oblivious to the commotion. The man beside him, a heavy-set older passenger, was standing, his face red with anger. I'm not sitting next to him, the man said loudly. drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "I want to be moved." Karen's voice was calm but firm. "Sir, we don't assign seats based on personal preferences." The man glared at her. "You're telling me I have to sit here and feel unsafe? This is unacceptable." Before Karen could respond, a voice cut through the air. "What exactly about him makes you feel unsafe?" It was Michael Thomas. He had risen from his seat and now stood a few rows away. His gaze locked on the man. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of authority. A challenge that could not be ignored. The man sputtered, his eyes darting between Michael and the young man. It's not about race," he said defensively. It's always about race," Michael said, his tone sharpening. "You may not want to admit it, but it is." The cabin went silent. Passengers leaned forward in their seats. Their curiosity mingled with unease. Karen felt her pulse quicken. She looked at Michael, then at the young man by the window, who had removed his headphones and was now watching the scene unfold with a mixture of confusion and resignation. "Sir," Karen said carefully, addressing the angry passenger, "I'm going to have to ask you to sit down and remain calm." "I'm not sitting here," the man snapped. "Move me, or I'm filing a complaint." Karen hesitated. Every decision she made in this moment felt fraught with consequence. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, the weight of their expectations pressing down on her. She glanced at Michael, whose gaze remained steady, unyielding. "Sir," she said finally, her voice trembling, "if you can't comply with the seating arrangement, we may have to involve security when we land." The man's face flushed even deeper. He opened his mouth to argue but seemed to think better of it. With a huff, he sat down, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. Karen exhaled, her shoulders sagging with relief. Michael nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement. Karen turned and made her way back to the galley, her mind racing. The fault line had shifted again, widening beneath her feet, and for the first time, she wasn't sure how to hold her balance. In the first-class cabin, James turned to his father, his voice low. "Why do they always act like it's not about race?" Michael sighed, his expression weary. "Because admitting it means admitting the system is broken, and most people would rather live in denial than face the truth." Michelle reached over, placing her hand over Michael's. "But we'll keep making them see," she said softly, "even if it takes a lifetime." And as the plane soared through the night sky, the weight of unspoken battles and shared resolve filled the air, binding the passengers in a tense, uneasy silence. The story was far from over, but the cracks in the facade had begun to show and there was no turning back. The cabin lights dimmed further as the flight entered the stretch of night where time seemed to dissolve. Passengers settled uneasily, their whispered conversations and restless shifting creating an ambient hum. But for some, peace was an illusion. Karen Miller sat in the galley, her hands tightly clasped around a mug of lukewarm coffee. She couldn't shake the events of the last hour, the confrontation in economy. Michael Thomas's calm but searing challenge. The ripple of unease that now seemed to hang in the air like static electricity. Her world, once neatly ordered and built on rules she believed to be fair, now felt shaky, like a house built on sand. She had been trained to control situations, to diffuse tension, but tonight, control seemed like a distant memory. In the first-class cabin, Michael Thomas leaned back in his seat, his face illuminated by the faint blue glow of the in-flight screen. He wasn't watching the movie, he was thinking, his mind swirling with memories he hadn't invited but couldn't dismiss. He thought of the time, years ago, when he was fresh out of med school, trying to board a flight to attend a conference in Boston. The gate agent had asked him point blank if he was sure he was in the right line. He thought of the patient he couldn't save because airport security delayed him for nearly an hour, insisting that his medical bag warranted extra scrutiny. He thought of the countless times he had been randomly selected for secondary screening. The way his children had learned to expect it as a routine part of travel. Now, as he sat in the present, he glanced at James, who was quietly reviewing his footage from earlier. His son's resilience filled him with pride, but it also stoked a deep, unrelenting anger. This isn't the world I wanted for him, he thought. Meanwhile, the passengers in economy had grown restless. The man who had refused to sit next to the young black man now fidgeted in his seat, muttering to himself. The energy in the cabin felt brittle, as if one wrong move could shatter the fragile calm. A flight attendant approached Karen in the galley. her face pale. "There's another issue," she whispered. Karen's stomach dropped. "What now?" "It's the same man from earlier," the attendant said. "He's arguing with the young man again. Some of the other passengers are getting involved." Karen closed her eyes briefly, willing herself to remain calm. She followed the attendant back to economy, where the scene was unfolding. The man was now standing, his voice loud and indignant. "I don't care what you think," he was shouting. "I shouldn't have to put up with this nonsense." The young man, to his credit, remained seated, his expression calm but weary. Around them, passengers murmured in disapproval, some openly glaring at the older man. "Sir," Karen said firmly, stepping into the fray, "you need to sit down and lower your voice. This behavior is unacceptable." The man whirled on her, his face flushed. "Unacceptable? I'm the one being harassed here. This isn't about race, it's about respect." Karen's resolve wavered as she felt the weight of the passengers' eyes on her. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. But before she could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "It's always about race," Michael said, stepping into the aisle. His voice was calm, but it carried an edge sharp enough to slice through the man's indignation. "You don't get to decide that it's not." The man's mouth opened and closed, as if searching for a retort. But no words came. "This young man hasn't done anything to you," Michael continued. "He's sitting in his seat, minding his business, but you're making a scene because you feel entitled to take up more space than you're owed." The cabin fell silent. Even the hum of the engines seemed to fade as Michael's words hung in the air. Karen watched, her pulse pounding in her ears. She wanted to intervene, to regain control of the situation. But she couldn't move. In first class, James had risen from his seat. He held his phone aloft, the camera capturing everything. "This is what we deal with," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience. "Every time we travel, it's the same story, and this is why we tell it." Michelle glanced at her son, her expression a mixture of pride and sorrow. "Keep recording," she said quietly. Karen's gaze darted to James, then back to the unfolding confrontation. The man was now visibly flustered, his bravado deflating under the weight of the moment. He sank back into his seat, muttering under his breath. Michael turned to Karen. "What are you going to do about this?" he asked, his tone direct but not unkind. "Because ignoring it isn't an option." Karen felt her throat tighten. She wanted to respond, but her words felt inadequate. Instead, she nodded and turned to the man. "Sir," she said, her voice steadier now, "if you can't comply with our rules and treat others with respect, we will have to involve security when we land." The man grumbled something unintelligible but slumped further into his seat, clearly unwilling to escalate further. Karen exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. Back in the galley, Karen leaned against the counter, her thoughts racing. She thought of her daughter, Emily, and their heated conversations about fairness and equity. Emily's voice echoed in her mind. "It's not enough to follow the rules. Mom, you have to question the rules. You have to see who they serve and who they harm." Karen's breath hitched. For years, she had dismissed Emily's words as youthful idealism, but now they felt like a lifeline of truth she couldn't ignore. As the plane soared through the night, the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. Passengers exchanged glances, some whispering, others simply staring ahead. In first class, Michelle reached for Michael's hand, their fingers intertwining in silent solidarity. James's phone buzzed with notifications as his footage spread across social media. The hashtag flying while black gaining momentum. And in the galley, Karen Miller stared out the small window, the vast expanse of stars stretching before her. For the first time, she felt the weight of the system she had served for decades, the cracks in its foundation, the voices it had silenced. And she realized that the storm brewing within her was one she could no longer ignore. The cabin hummed with a tense quiet, a fragile veneer over the turbulence within. The faint sound of passengers flipping through magazines or tapping on tablets was punctuated by the occasional cough. But beneath the surface, emotions simmered: anger, unease, shame, each thread tightening the weave of tension that bound the passengers, crew, and the Thomas family together in an uncomfortable intimacy. Karen Miller sat in the galley, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at nothing. Her mind replayed Michael Thomas's words, "Ignoring it isn't an option." She had spent decades believing that following the rules was enough. That neutrality was fairness. But tonight, neutrality felt like a betrayal. In first class, James Thomas's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. He scrolled through the flood of comments on his video. His expression a mixture of pride and exhaustion. "This is going viral, Mom," he said, tilting the screen toward Michelle. "People are paying attention." Michelle leaned in, her face unreadable. "Good," she said after a moment. "They should." Michael, seated across the aisle, was watching the cabin carefully. He could feel the energy shifting around them, the furtive glances, the whispered conversations. The incident in economy had left ripples. And those ripples were spreading. But it wasn't just about them anymore. This was something larger, something that refused to be contained. The quiet broke when the plane shuddered violently, jolting passengers in their seats. Gasps rippled through the cabin as overhead bins rattled and drinks spilled onto tray tables. Karen grabbed the counter for balance as the plane steadied itself, the turbulence easing momentarily. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," came the calm voice of Captain David Chen over the intercom. "We're experiencing some turbulence, but it should pass shortly. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The announcement did little to calm the tension. Instead, it seemed to amplify the sense of unease, as though the turbulence in the air mirrored the conflict below. In the economy cabin, the man who had caused the earlier commotion sat rigid in his seat, his arms crossed tightly. The young black man beside him stared out the window, his headphones back on, but his posture was tense, his jaw set. Across the aisle, a woman whispered to her companion, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "This whole flight feels cursed," she muttered. "First the drama in first class. Now this." The word drama echoed in Karen's mind as she moved down the aisle, checking on passengers. When she reached the Thomases' row, she hesitated. Michael was speaking quietly to James, his voice low and firm. "Don't let them shake you," he said. "They want you to lose your composure. Don't give them that." James nodded, his hands resting on his phone. Michelle looked up at Karen, her expression neutral but piercing. "Is there something you need?" she asked, her voice measured. Karen opened her mouth, but no words came. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the expectation, the scrutiny, the unspoken demand for accountability. Finally, she said, "I just wanted to see if you needed anything." Michelle's gaze softened, just slightly. "We're fine," she said. "Thank you." Karen nodded and moved on. But her heart was racing. She could feel the cracks widening beneath her feet, the ground shifting in ways she couldn't control. The second wave of turbulence hit harder. This time, the plane lurched violently, sending trays and cups flying. Passengers screamed, clutching their armrests. A child wailed somewhere in economy. The seatbelt sign flashed insistently, accompanied by a high-pitched ding. Karen rushed to secure the galley, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. But her mind was elsewhere, caught in the storm of her own making. She thought of her daughter Emily, of the arguments they had had over dinner, of the way Emily's voice would rise with frustration. "Mom, you don't see it because you don't have to live it. But for people like me, like them, it's everywhere." For the first time, Karen wondered if Emily was right. In first class, Michael Thomas unbuckled his seatbelt despite the turbulence. "Stay here," he told Michelle, his voice steady, before rising to assist a woman who had dropped her baby's bottle. He moved with the calm precision of a man used to high-pressure situations, his years as a doctor evident in his every motion. Karen watched him from the galley, a pang of admiration cutting through her unease. But the moment was short-lived. Another passenger, a middle-aged man seated 2 rows behind the Thomases, stood and pointed an accusatory finger. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "Why is he walking around during turbulence? Isn't that against the rules?" Michael turned, his expression calm but firm. "I'm helping someone," he said evenly. "Is that a problem for you?" The man bristled. "It's not about helping. It's about following the rules. People like you always think you're above them." The words hung in the air like poison, their meaning unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the cabin as passengers turned to watch the exchange. Michelle stood, her eyes flashing with fury. "People like him?" she said, her voice low but deadly. "You want to explain what you mean by that?" Karen's heart pounded as she hurried toward the scene, her mind racing. She reached Michael just as Michelle's voice rose. "We've followed every rule," Michelle said. her voice trembling with restrained anger. "We've complied with every request. But that's never enough, is it? Because people like you don't see rules. You see us. And that's the real problem." The man looked away, his face reddening, but he didn't respond. Karen stepped between them, her voice shaky but firm. "Let's all remain calm," she said. "Please return to your seats." Michelle turned to Karen, her eyes blazing. "Calm?" she said, her voice heavy with incredulity. "You want calm after everything that's happened? How much more do we have to endure before you stop asking us to be calm?" Karen opened her mouth, but no words came. She could feel the weight of every eye in the cabin, the unspoken demand for an answer she didn't have. For the first time, she realized that her neutrality, her desire to keep the peace, wasn't just ineffective. It was complicit. The plane steadied again, the turbulence easing as quickly as it had come. But the tension in the cabin remained, a living, breathing thing that couldn't be ignored. Karen returned to the galley, her hands trembling as she gripped the counter. In her mind, Emily's voice rang out again. "Fairness isn't about following the rules, Mom. It's about recognizing when the rules are wrong." For the first time, Karen began to see what her daughter had been trying to tell her. And she knew, with a clarity that felt like a punch to the gut, that the real storm wasn't outside the plane. It was here, inside, and she was at its center. The cabin had grown eerily quiet, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. It was the stillness that came after a storm, heavy with the promise of another. Karen Miller stood in the galley, her hands gripping the edges of the counter as if holding on to an anchor. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, and her mind raced. For years, she had believed in the order of her profession, the rules, the protocols, the promise that if you followed them, the world would run smoothly. But tonight, those rules had unraveled, leaving her adrift in uncharted waters. In first class, James Thomas's phone buzzed incessantly, the notifications cascading in like waves. His footage of the earlier confrontation was spreading across social media, igniting a firestorm of debate. "James," Michelle said softly, her voice steady despite the tension in her shoulders. "What are they saying?" James scrolled through the comments, his expression flickering between frustration and determination. "It's a mix," he said. "Some people are outraged. Others are saying we're overreacting." Michelle's jaw tightened. "The usual," she said. "People who've never lived it telling us how to feel." Across the aisle, Michael watched them in silence. His fingers drummed lightly against the armrest, a rhythm that betrayed his internal storm. He had spent his life navigating these moments, learning to swallow the indignities, to smile when he wanted to scream. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the pressure was too much. Karen stepped out of the galley, forcing herself to walk the length of the plane. She moved slowly, checking seatbelts and offering strained smiles. But her focus was fractured. Every passenger seemed to carry a question in their eyes. "What are you going to do?" When she reached first class, she hesitated at the Thomas's row. James glanced up from his phone, his expression unreadable. Michelle was staring out the window, her posture rigid. Karen cleared her throat. "Is there anything I can get you?" she asked, her voice thin. Michelle turned, her gaze sharp. "Yes," she said. "You can tell me why my family is always treated like this." Karen's breath caught. "I don't know what you mean," she stammered. Michelle leaned forward slightly, her tone low but cutting. "Don't you?" she said. "Because I think you do. I think you've known all night. But you don't want to admit it." Karen opened her mouth to respond. But before she could, another voice cut in. "Excuse me," the man from economy, the one who had refused to sit next to the young black passenger, was now storming up the aisle toward them. His face was flushed, his steps heavy with anger. Michael stood immediately, positioning himself between the man and his family. "What's the problem?" he asked, his voice calm but unyielding. The man jabbed a finger in Michael's direction. "You people are the problem," he said. "You've been causing trouble this whole flight. Filming everything, making a scene. It's disgusting." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, their eyes darting between the man and Michael. Karen felt her heart lurch. She stepped forward, raising her hands in a placating gesture. "Sir, please return to your seat," she said. "This behavior is unacceptable." But the man ignored her, his focus locked on Michael. "You think you're better than everyone else because you're in first class?" he sneered. "You don't belong here." Michael's jaw tightened. his fists clenching at his sides. "Say that again," he said quietly, his voice dangerously low. "Michael," Michelle warned, placing a hand on his arm. "He's not worth it." Karen stepped between them, her pulse pounding. "That's enough," she said, her voice firmer now. "Sir, if you don't return to your seat, we will have to involve the authorities when we land." The man hesitated, his bravado faltering under the weight of her words. He glanced around, realizing for the first time that the entire cabin was watching. Slowly, reluctantly, he turned and stalked back to economy. Muttering under his breath, Karen turned back to the Thomases, her face pale. "I'm so sorry," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "This shouldn't have happened." Michelle stared at her, her expression unreadable. "You're right," she said, "it shouldn't have, but it did, and it keeps happening." Karen felt the weight of those words settle on her chest. She nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're right," she said, "and I'm sorry." For a moment, the air between them was heavy with unspoken truths. Then Michael sat back down, his movements deliberate. Michelle turned back to the window, her shoulders still tense. James, however, kept his gaze on Karen, his eyes searching hers. "You can do better," he said simply. "You have to." The rest of the flight passed in a tense, uneasy silence. Karen retreated to the galley, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She thought of the training sessions she had dismissed, the conversations she had avoided, the moments she had chosen neutrality over action. For the first time, she saw them for what they were, not acts of fairness, but failures of courage. As the plane began its descent, Karen glanced out the small galley window. The city lights of their destination sparkled below, a reminder of the world waiting for them. But tonight, that world felt different. The events of the flight had exposed fault lines she could no longer ignore, cracks in a system she had once believed in without question. The plane landed with a soft thud, the tension in the cabin finally breaking as passengers began to gather their belongings. Karen stood at the front, watching as the Thomases disembarked. Michelle paused briefly, her gaze meeting Karen's. "Change doesn't start with apologies," Michelle said quietly. "It starts with action." Karen nodded, the words sinking deep. "I understand," she said, "and I'll do better." Michelle held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, her family following behind her. As Karen watched them go, a sense of resolve began to build within her. She didn't know what her next steps would be, but she knew one thing: neutrality was no longer an option. The storm within her had cleared, leaving behind a quiet determination to confront the truths she had avoided for too long. And as the terminal doors closed behind the Thomases, Karen Miller knew that her journey was just beginning. The airport terminal was a blur of motion, a living organism of travelers rushing to their gates, screens flashing departures and arrivals, and the echo of announcements crackling overhead. For most passengers, the flight was already a memory, another entry in the mundane logbook of air travel. But for Karen Miller, the events of Flight 216 clung to her like a second skin. She stood at the gate, her shoulders stiff, watching the Thomases disappear into the crowd. Each step they took away from her felt like a judgment, a verdict on her failure to act sooner, to do better. Michelle Thomas walked briskly, her hand gripping Ava's. James trailed behind, his phone still buzzing with notifications. Michael stayed silent, his gaze straight ahead, his jaw tight. They moved with the purpose of people who had weathered storms before, who had learned to carry their hurt without letting it weigh them down, at least not visibly. When they reached a quiet corner near baggage claim, Michelle exhaled sharply, releasing Ava's hand to rub her temples. "We shouldn't have to keep doing this," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "We shouldn't," Michael agreed, his voice low but steady. "But we do." James looked up from his phone, his expression conflicted. "Mom, the video is everywhere," he said. "News outlets are picking it up. People are sharing their own stories. It's blowing up." Michelle's eyes softened as she turned to her son. "And what are they saying?" she asked. "Some are angry," James replied. "A lot of them are. But others, they're dismissing it, calling it a one-off incident, saying we're making a big deal out of nothing." Michael scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping him. "Of course they are. That's how it always starts: denial, then deflection, anything to avoid admitting the truth." Michelle nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "We need to keep the pressure on," she said. We've got their attention now. But it won't last unless we act. Back at the gate, Karen was approached by Sarah Goldman, the FAA investigator who had been quietly observing the flight. Sarah's expression was calm but serious, her tablet tucked under her arm. "Karen," she said, her voice cutting through the haze of Karen's thoughts. "Can we talk?" Karen turned, startled. "Of course," she said, though her voice was hesitant. "What's this about?" Sarah gestured toward a nearby seating area, away from the flow of passengers. Once seated, she leaned forward, her tone measured. "I've been monitoring flights like this one for weeks," she began. "The Thomases aren't an isolated case. What happened on your flight is part of a larger pattern we're investigating." Karen frowned, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I didn't mean to treat them unfairly," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought I was following the rules." "That's the problem," Sarah said gently. "The rules are often written in a way that allows bias to seep in. They look neutral on the surface, but in practice, they disproportionately harm certain groups. The question isn't whether you meant to treat them unfairly, it's whether you're willing to acknowledge the system you're part of." Karen felt the words hit her like a blow. For years, she had prided herself on being a professional, a rule follower. Now, she was being asked to confront the idea that the very system she trusted was flawed, that her adherence to it had caused harm. The Thomases reached the car rental desk, where Michelle handed over her ID with practiced efficiency. As they waited for the paperwork to be processed, Michael's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's the ACLU," he said, showing Michelle the email. "They want to meet with us. They're building a case against the airline industry for systemic discrimination." Michelle took the phone, scanning the email quickly. "This is what we've been waiting for," she said, her voice firm. "A chance to make real change." James leaned over, reading the email with wide eyes. "They're asking if we'll testify," he said. Michael nodded. "They'll want our footage, too," he said, glancing at James. "That live stream might become evidence." James swallowed hard, the weight of his actions settling on him. "Do you think it'll help?" he asked. Michelle placed a hand on his shoulder. "It will," she said, "but only if we're willing to follow through." Back in the airport, Karen found herself in a small conference room with Sarah and a representative from the airline's corporate office. The representative, a polished woman in a tailored suit, spoke in a tone that was calm but defensive. "We take allegations of discrimination seriously," she said, "but we also have to balance that with ensuring the safety and comfort of all passengers." Karen's jaw tightened. The words felt rehearsed, hollow. "Comfort for whom?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "Because it wasn't comfortable for the Thomases." The representative blinked, momentarily thrown off. "We understand your concern, Karen," she said, her tone softening. "That's why we're implementing new training programs for staff." "It's not just about training," Karen said, her voice rising. "It's about the culture, the way we're taught to see passengers, to prioritize some over others without even realizing it. If we don't address that, nothing will change." Sarah watched the exchange silently, her expression thoughtful. When Karen finished speaking, Sarah nodded. "She's right," she said. "This isn't just about individual behavior. It's about the system, and systems don't change without pressure." As the Thomases loaded their luggage into the rental car, Michelle glanced back at the airport terminal. Her expression was unreadable, her thoughts a swirl of anger, exhaustion, and determination. "Mom?" James asked, his voice hesitant. "Do you think they'll listen? The airline, I mean, do you think they'll actually change?" Michelle sighed, closing the trunk with a soft thud. "They'll listen," she said, "because we won't give them a choice." Michael nodded, starting the car. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice resolute. "We've made them see, now we make them act." And as the car pulled away from the airport, the Thomases carried with them the weight of a fight far from over. A fight they had no choice but to continue. Back inside, Karen Miller watched the plane she had just served take off for its next destination. A distant speck against the darkening sky. For the first time, she wondered not where it was going but what kind of world it would land in. The following morning, the story of Flight 216 dominated headlines and social media feeds. Across the country, people debated the footage James Thomas had captured, the heated confrontation in the aisle, the visible discomfort of Karen Miller as she struggled to navigate the moment. and the simmering tensions that seemed to embody the nation's unspoken conflicts. Karen sat in her modest kitchen, her uniform folded neatly on the table before her, untouched. Her phone buzzed incessantly, each notification a reminder that she was now part of a story far larger than herself. She didn't know whether to feel ashamed or defiant. She had spent her career believing in the rules, and now those same rules felt like shackles. She scrolled through the comments on the video James had posted. Some defended her actions. She was just doing her job. Why does everything have to be about race? Others were scathing. This is exactly why the system needs to change, because people like her think they're neutral when they're not. Her daughter Emily's name popped up on her phone screen. Karen hesitated before answering, her voice thick with exhaustion. Emily. Mom. Emily began, her tone soft but steady. I saw the video. Karen closed her eyes. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she said quietly. I know, Emily replied, but that's not the point. The point is, it did happen, and now you have a choice. You can either defend the system or start questioning it. Karen's throat tightened. I don't know if I'm strong enough, she admitted. You are, Emily said firmly. You just have to start. Meanwhile, the Thomases were gathered in a conference room at the ACLU's regional office. Michelle sat at the head of the table, her laptop open in front of her, while Michael leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. James sat beside them, his phone resting face down on the table, a rare moment of stillness for him. The ACLU representative, a sharp-eyed woman named Nadia, spoke with precision. Your case has sparked a national conversation, she said. We've been tracking the responses, and the public is divided. That's to be expected. But what matters is the leverage we have right now. If you're willing to testify, we can use this moment to push for systemic change. Michael nodded slowly. We've fought battles like this before, he said, but this feels different, bigger. It is, Nadia replied. The question is, are you ready for the backlash? Because it's coming. James frowned. Backlash? He asked. Nadia leaned forward, her tone serious. The airline will defend itself. They'll frame this as a one-off incident, claim that their protocols are sound, and try to discredit your story. You'll be called complainers, troublemakers, and worse. Michelle's eyes hardened. We've been called worse before, she said. We're not backing down. At the airline's headquarters, a crisis management meeting was underway. The CEO, a sharp-dressed man in his late 50s, addressed the room with clipped urgency. This is a PR nightmare, he said, gesturing to a screen showing clips of the video. We need a response, and we need it yesterday. The communications director spoke up. We've issued a statement expressing concern and promising to review our policies. But it's not enough. People want action. Then give them action, the CEO said. Implement bias training. Create a task force, whatever it takes to make this go away. But the system isn't designed to address bias at its root. Another executive murmured. If we make surface-level changes, we'll just be kicking the can down the road. The room fell silent. No one wanted to admit what they all knew. The problem wasn't just the actions of one flight attendant or one passenger. It was the entire culture, a culture that had been built to serve some while quietly excluding others. That evening, Karen received an unexpected call from Michelle Thomas. She hesitated before answering, her voice cautious. Mrs. Thomas? Karen, Michelle said, her tone measured. I'm not calling to berate you. I think you've had enough of that. Karen let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Then why are you calling? She asked. To ask if you're willing to help. Michelle said. This isn't just about what happened on that flight. It's about what happens every day to people like me. Like my family. You've seen it now. You've been part of it. So the question is, what are you going to do about it? Karen felt her chest tighten. I don't know where to start, she admitted. Start by listening, Michelle said, and then start speaking up. The next morning, Karen stood in front of her bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection. Her uniform hung on the back of the door, a symbol of the identity she had built over decades. But today, it felt heavier, like armor that no longer fit. At the same time, Michelle sat at her kitchen table, drafting an op-ed for a major newspaper. Michael read over her shoulder, nodding approvingly as she outlined the systemic changes they were demanding: transparent passenger policies, mandatory bias training, and an independent review board for complaints. And James, ever vigilant, opened his phone to record a video. "We're not just fighting for ourselves," he said, his voice steady. "We're fighting for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. And we're not stopping until we're heard." The world outside moved on. But for those at the center of the storm, there was no turning back. The Thomases were determined to hold the system accountable. Karen, for the first time, began to see that her silence was part of the problem. And as the ripples of Flight 216 spread outward, the pressure for change grew stronger. The fault lines more exposed. The battle was far from over. But the ground had shifted. And in that shifting, there was hope not just for justice, but for something greater. The Thomases had faced countless battles before. But this time, it felt different. The air was electric with possibility and fraught with tension. As though the world had paused, holding its breath. Their home became a command center, laptops open on the dining table. Phones buzzing with messages. Reporters calling for interviews. The stakes had never been higher. And the pressure weighed heavily on all of them. Michelle sat at the table, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she drafted her testimony for the congressional hearing scheduled in a week. The ACLU had confirmed that their case was now part of a larger investigation into systemic racial discrimination in the airline industry. This wasn't just a fight for acknowledgement, it was a fight for change. James paced the room, his phone in hand. His video of the flight had become a flashpoint, amassing millions of views and igniting a national conversation. But with the attention came backlash. His phone buzzed constantly, a mix of support and vitriol. "You're blowing this out of proportion," one commenter had written. "You're the real problem." He clenched his jaw, the words stinging more than he cared to admit. Michelle noticed and looked up. "Don't let them get to you," she said. "This is what happens when people are afraid of the truth. It's just frustrating." James muttered, "No matter what we say, there's always someone trying to twist it." Michael placed a steadying hand on his son's shoulder. "That's because the truth makes them uncomfortable," he said, "but that doesn't mean we stop telling it." Elsewhere, Karen Miller was grappling with her own reckoning. She sat in her living room, her phone buzzing on the coffee table with messages from colleagues, friends, and strangers. Some were supportive, others were less kind. "I saw your name in the news." One message read, "You're making us all look bad." But another said, "Thank you for admitting you were wrong. That takes courage." Karen's thoughts were a storm. She had spent the last 2 decades believing that if she followed the rules, she was doing her job. Now, she was questioning everything. The system she had trusted. The protocols she had enforced, they weren't as impartial as she had believed. And her silence had made her complicit. Her daughter Emily arrived unannounced, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. She sat across from Karen, folding her hands in her lap. "Mom," Emily began, "I know this is hard for you. But this is your chance to do something real. To be part of the solution." Karen looked at her daughter, her eyes tired but resolute. "I don't know where to start," she admitted. "Start by listening," Emily said, "and then speak out. People trust you. Mom, use that trust to push for change." Karen nodded slowly, her heart heavy but her resolve strengthening. She wasn't sure what the path forward looked like, but she knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. The airline executives were not as calm. In their glass-walled boardroom, a sense of panic permeated the air. The CEO paced at the head of the table, his voice sharp. "We can't ignore this any longer," he said. "The public backlash is growing. The stock is dropping. We need a plan." The communications director cleared her throat. "We've drafted an apology and outlined a plan for mandatory bias training. But we'll need to do more than that to rebuild trust." "And what about the Thomases?" someone else asked. "They're the face of this now. How do we handle them?" The room fell silent. No one wanted to admit the truth that they couldn't handle the Thomases. Not in the way they were used to handling problems. This wasn't going away with a carefully worded statement or a photo op. This was bigger than them. A week later, the congressional hearing was packed. Journalists lined the back wall, their cameras poised, while activists and community leaders filled the seats. Michelle sat at the witness table, flanked by Michael and James. Karen was in the audience, seated beside Emily. She had insisted on coming, despite her anxiety. This, she realized, was part of her journey too. The chairman's gavel struck, and the room fell silent. "We are here today to discuss systemic bias in the airline industry," he began. "This is not a new issue, but it has been thrust into the spotlight by recent events. Mrs. Thomas, you have the floor." Michelle stood, her presence commanding but calm. She spoke with precision, recounting the events of the flight and placing them within the broader context of her family's experiences. "This is not an isolated incident," she said. "It is part of a pattern that has persisted for far too long. We've been told to be patient, to wait for change, but patience has not brought us justice. It's time for action." The room erupted into applause. But Michelle held up a hand, silencing them. "This is not just about my family," she continued. "It's about every person who has been made to feel like they don't belong. And it's about holding those in power accountable." When she finished, there was a moment of silence, heavy with the weight of her words. Then James stood, his voice steady but impassioned. "I'm not just here as her son," he said. "I'm here as someone who refuses to accept that this is just the way things are. We deserve better, and we won't stop until we get it." As the hearing ended, Karen approached the Thomases, her hands trembling. Michelle turned, her expression unreadable. "I want to help," Karen said, her voice breaking. "I know I can't undo what happened, but I want to be part of the change." Michelle studied her for a moment, then extended her hand. "Then let's get to work," she said. And as the cameras flashed and the world watched, a small but significant alliance was forged, one that would challenge not just an industry, but the very foundations of a system that had long ignored its own inequities. The fire had been ignited, and there was no extinguishing it now. The air in the conference hall was electric with anticipation. Rows of reporters adjusted their cameras. Activists whispered among themselves, and representatives from major airlines sat stiffly in their chairs, their expressions betraying their unease. At the center of it all, the Thomases sat together, a visible symbol of resilience. Michelle's calm demeanor, Michael's quiet strength, James's youthful determination, and Ava's innocence formed a tableau that was both heart-wrenching and powerful. Karen Miller sat a few rows behind them, her palms damp with nerves. She had spent the last week grappling with the weight of her complicity, rehearsing what she would say if called upon. Emily sat beside her, squeezing her hand occasionally in silent encouragement. Karen's mind buzzed with the realization that this moment was about more than her redemption. It was about standing for something larger than herself. The event began with opening remarks from lawmakers, their speeches filled with promises of accountability and reform. But the crowd was restless. They weren't here for platitudes, they were here for action. When Michelle took the stage, the room fell silent. She approached the podium with measured steps, her presence commanding yet humble. She scanned the audience, her gaze steady. Before beginning, "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the weight of conviction. "We are here today because what happened on Flight 216 is not an isolated incident. It is part of a system that has been allowed to thrive unchecked, a system that prioritizes convenience over justice, perception over fairness." She paused, letting the words sink in. "For years, my family and I have endured microaggressions, outright discrimination, and the constant reminder that, to some, we do not belong. On that flight, we were made to feel invisible. But invisibility is not silence. And today, I refuse to let our story be ignored." The audience erupted into applause. But Michelle held up a hand, quieting them. "This is not just about my family," she continued. "It is about every family who has been told to wait their turn, to accept crumbs when they deserve equality. It is about dismantling a culture that allows discrimination to hide behind policies." The hearing reached a crescendo when James stepped forward, holding his phone. "I want to show you something," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. He played a portion of his viral video, the footage of his family's calm defiance juxtaposed with the vitriol they faced. The room watched in silence, the tension palpable. "This isn't just a story," James said, his voice rising. "It's reality for millions of people every day. And it's not enough to say, 'We're sorry.' We need to change the rules, the culture, the entire system." As he stepped back, the applause was thunderous, but the room was not without its dissenters. A representative from the airline industry stood, his face tight with frustration. "We understand the concerns raised here," he said, his tone defensive, "but we must also consider the challenges of running a global operation. These incidents are rare." "They're not rare," Michelle interrupted, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "They're routine. The only thing rare is that this time, it was caught on camera." The representative hesitated, clearly unprepared for the directness of her response. The room murmured in agreement, the tide turning further against him. Karen felt her pulse quicken. This was her moment. She stood, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "I'm Karen Miller," she said, addressing the room. "I was the flight attendant on Flight 216. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. Karen took a deep breath and continued. "For years, I believed that following the rules was enough. That if I treated everyone the same, I was doing my job. But that flight showed me how wrong I was." Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. "The truth is, the rules themselves are flawed. They allow bias to fester, to hide behind the guise of neutrality. And I was complicit in that. But I'm here today to say that I want to do better. I need to do better." Karen turned to the Thomases, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I owe you an apology, not just for what happened on that flight, but for every time I chose silence over action. I can't change the past, but I promise to use my voice to fight for a better future." The room erupted into applause, but Karen barely heard it. She only saw Michelle nodding, her expression softening, and James offering a faint, encouraging smile. As the hearing concluded, the Thomases were surrounded by reporters, their microphones thrust forward with rapid-fire questions. Michelle handled them with her usual grace, while James captured the moment on his phone. Karen stood on the sidelines, watching as the family she had once wronged became the face of a movement. She felt Emily's hand on her shoulder. "You did good, Mom," Emily said softly. "Really good." Karen nodded, a lump forming in her throat. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for herself, but for the world she had helped shape, however imperfectly. Outside, the crowd dispersed, but the momentum didn't fade. The story of Flight 216 continued to ripple outward, igniting conversations, protests, and demands for change. The airline industry announced a sweeping overhaul of its policies, driven not just by public pressure but by the relentless advocacy of the Thomases. And while the fight was far from over, something fundamental had shifted. The walls that had seemed so immovable now showed cracks. The silence that had once suffocated now gave way to voices rising in unison. For Michelle, Michael, James, and Ava, the journey was ongoing. For Karen, it was just beginning. But for everyone who had ever been told to wait, to endure, to stay silent, this was a moment to hold on to, a reminder that even the smallest voices could ignite the largest flames. And that change, no matter how slow, was always worth fighting for. The nation had reached a boiling point. The events of Flight 216, captured in stark detail by James Thomas, had set off a firestorm that refused to die down. Protests erupted at airports across the country. Social media brimmed with stories from passengers sharing their own encounters with systemic bias, their voices coalescing into a powerful demand for accountability. In Washington, D.C., the battle for change was in full swing. Michelle Thomas stood at the helm of a growing coalition of activists, legal experts, and community leaders. Her calm resolve had become a beacon for those who felt unseen, her words a rallying cry. But the path forward was anything but smooth. It began with the counterattack. The airline industry, backed by a well-funded lobbying arm, launched a public relations campaign aimed at deflecting blame. Ads filled television screens and social media feeds, emphasizing the safety and professionalism of airline employees and framing the Thomases' experience as an unfortunate outlier. The message was clear. This isn't a systemic problem. It's an isolated incident. Michelle read the headlines with a tightening jaw. She could see the strategy for what it was: a deliberate attempt to reframe the narrative, to turn public opinion against her family. That evening, as the coalition met in a cramped office space, she addressed the group with a fire in her voice. "They're trying to make us the villains," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "But we're not backing down. We have the truth on our side, and we're going to make sure everyone sees it." Meanwhile, Karen Miller was preparing for her own reckoning. She had agreed to testify before a Senate committee investigating systemic discrimination in the airline industry. It was a decision she had agonized over. But in the end, her conscience left her no choice. On the morning of her testimony, Karen stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her blazer. Her hands trembled, and her reflection seemed to stare back at her, questioning her resolve. Emily, standing behind her, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You're doing the right thing, Emily said softly, and you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be honest. Karen nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. I just hope it's enough, she murmured. The hearing room was packed. The atmosphere crackled with tension as senators, reporters, and members of the public waited for the session to begin. Michelle sat with her family in the front row, her expression calm but alert. Karen entered quietly, her heart pounding as she took her seat at the witness table. When her turn came, she spoke slowly, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. For over 20 years, I believed that following the rules was enough, she began, but the truth is, those rules are part of a system that wasn't designed to protect everyone equally. And on Flight 216, I saw firsthand how that system fails people. She paused, glancing at the Thomases, who watched her intently. I made mistakes that day, she continued, mistakes that stemmed from my own blind spots and the biases built into the system I served. And for that, I am deeply sorry, but apologies aren't enough. What we need is change. Her testimony was met with a mix of skepticism and applause. Some questioned her motives, accusing her of seeking redemption at the expense of her colleagues. Others saw her as a brave whistleblower, willing to speak out against a flawed system. But Karen didn't care about the labels. For the first time in years, she felt free to confront the truth and fight for something better. As the weeks passed, the pressure continued to mount. The coalition organized a nationwide campaign, holding rallies, town halls, and media events. James became a prominent voice, using his platform to amplify stories from other marginalized passengers. His live streams and videos reached millions, turning him into an unexpected leader in the movement. But the backlash grew louder as well. Death threats arrived in their inboxes. Trolls flooded their social media accounts with hateful messages. Even Ava, too young to fully understand, sensed the weight of the moment, clinging to her mother with quiet fear. One night, as Michelle tucked Ava into bed, the little girl whispered, "Are we going to be okay, Mommy?" Michelle's heart broke at the question. She kissed Ava's forehead and said, "We're going to make sure everyone is okay. That's why we're doing this." The turning point came when a former airline executive came forward with damning evidence, internal memos showing how certain policies disproportionately targeted minority passengers. The revelation sent shockwaves through the industry, forcing CEOs to issue statements of contrition and promising sweeping reforms. But the Thomases and their allies knew promises weren't enough. In a final act of defiance, the coalition announced a march on Washington. Thousands of people gathered on the National Mall, their voices rising in unison. Michelle stood at the podium, flanked by her family and Karen. "This isn't just about airlines," she said, her voice carrying over the sea of faces. "This is about every institution that tells people they don't belong. It's about dismantling the systems that divide us and building something better. And we won't stop until justice is more than a promise, it's a reality." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy palpable. And for the first time in weeks, Michelle allowed herself to feel hope not just for her family, but for everyone who had ever been silenced or overlooked. As the sun set on the march, Karen found herself standing beside Michelle, watching the crowd disperse. "Thank you," Karen said quietly, "for letting me be part of this." Michelle turned to her, a faint smile on her lips. "Thank you for showing up," she replied. "That's where it starts." And as the city lights began to twinkle against the darkening sky, they both knew the fight wasn't over. But they also knew they weren't alone. Together, they had reached the edge of change, and they were ready to leap. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that doesn't merely fall but settles, heavy and unrelenting. All eyes were fixed on the Thomases, seated at the plaintiff's table. Michelle sat poised, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her gaze unyielding. Beside her, Michael's presence was solid and steady, while James, wearing the mantle of a young leader, had his phone tucked away, a quiet testament to the power of his lens. Karen Miller sat a few rows behind them, her heart pounding. She wasn't a witness today, her part in the testimony had ended weeks ago, but she had come to stand in solidarity. This was the culmination of everything that had happened since Flight 216. A moment years in the making. The judge entered, her robe flowing like a dark wave, and the murmurs in the room stilled. "This court is now in session," she said, her voice even but firm. We are here to address allegations of systemic racial bias in the airline industry. The case had become a watershed moment, drawing national attention and galvanizing a movement. The Thomases' legal team had built their argument meticulously, weaving together data, personal testimonies, and the damning internal memos leaked by the former executive. The airline's lawyers had tried to paint the incidents as isolated, the actions of individuals rather than a system, but every counterpoint had been met with the undeniable weight of evidence. When it was time for Michelle to speak, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. She rose, her every movement deliberate, and approached the stand. The oath was administered, and she began her testimony. "My name is Michelle Thomas," she said, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "I am here because my family's experience on Flight 216 was not an anomaly. It was the latest in a long line of moments where we were made to feel less than. Where we were reminded that the systems meant to serve us are built to exclude us." She recounted the events of the flight, her voice unwavering even as she spoke of the humiliation, the anger, and the exhaustion. But she didn't stop there. She painted a broader picture, one that extended far beyond her family. She spoke of the countless stories that had flooded her inbox after James's video went viral. The voices of people who had been silenced for too long. "This isn't just about us," she said, her voice rising with conviction. "It's about everyone who has been told they don't belong. It's about ensuring that no child has to grow up learning to navigate discrimination as though it's a natural part of life. Because it's not natural. It's a choice. And we're here to demand that it stops." The courtroom was silent when she finished, the gravity of her words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Even the airline's lead attorney seemed momentarily shaken, his polished demeanor cracking at the edges. As the trial progressed, the tension only deepened. Each day brought new revelation statistics showing disproportionate screening of black and brown passengers. Testimonies from employees who had witnessed discriminatory practices but felt powerless to intervene. And, most damning of all, recordings of internal discussions where senior executives dismissed complaints as inevitable noise. For Karen, every piece of evidence felt like another brick crashing down. She thought of the years she had spent enforcing those rules, believing she was neutral, fair, just. She thought of the moments she had dismissed complaints, chalking them up to misunderstandings. And she thought of Emily's words, "The rules aren't broken for you, Mom, but they're crushing other people." On the final day of the trial, James was called to the stand. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. He was the youngest person to testify, but his presence was magnetic, his voice steady as he recounted his perspective. "I started filming because I wanted people to see what we go through," he said, "because when you tell them, they don't believe you. They think you're exaggerating or playing the victim. But when they see it, when they can't look away, that's when they start to understand." The opposing attorney tried to discredit him, suggesting that his videos were edited to provoke outrage. James met the challenge head-on. "I didn't have to edit anything," he said. "The truth is enough." The judge's ruling came days later, and it sent shockwaves through the nation. The airline was found liable for fostering a culture that enabled systemic discrimination. The court ordered sweeping changes, including mandatory bias training, the creation of an independent oversight committee, and restitution for affected passengers. But more than that, the case set a precedent, opening the door for similar lawsuits and sparking a broader reckoning across industries. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, their signs and voices filling the air with hope and determination. When the Thomases emerged, the cheers were deafening. Reporters clamored for interviews, but Michelle held up a hand, silencing them. "This isn't the end," she said, her voice carrying over the noise. "It's a beginning. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with moments like this. Moments where we refuse to be silent, where we demand accountability, where we insist on a better world. And we won't stop here." Karen watched from the sidelines, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, she felt a deep, unshakable pride not in the role she had once played, but in the choice she had made to confront it. Months later, the ripple effects of the trial were still being felt. Airlines across the country were revising their policies. Community groups were organizing to hold them accountable. And the movement ignited by the Thomases continued to grow. For James, life had changed in ways he hadn't expected. His platform had become a tool for advocacy, and he used it to amplify voices that had long been silenced. For Michael, the trial had reignited his sense of purpose, reminding him that healing wasn't just about treating the body, it was about addressing the wounds of the soul. And for Michelle, the fight continued, each victory a step closer to the justice she had always believed in. As for Karen, she left her job with the airline and joined a nonprofit dedicated to addressing systemic bias in the workplace. She still had much to learn, but she embraced the journey, knowing that change began with her willingness to confront the truth. In the end, the story of Flight 216 was more than a moment, it was a movement. It was a testament to the power of resilience, the necessity of confrontation, and the unyielding hope for a better world. And for those who had been told to wait, to endure, to stay silent, it was proof that their voices mattered, that they were not invisible, that they belonged. The horizon stretched wide and infinite, a reminder that the fight for justice never truly ends. But as the sun set on one chapter, it rose on another, casting its light on a world that, though imperfect, was moving however slowly toward equity.